A Canadian Forces Base or CFB is a military installation of the Canadian Forces. For a facility to qualify as a Canadian Forces Base, it must station one or more major units. Minor installations are named Canadian Forces Station or CFS. A Canadian Forces Station could host a single minor unit. Many of these facilities are now decommissioned for administrative purposes and function as detachments of a larger Canadian Forces Base nearby. Current Canadian Army note: primary lodger units at Canadian Forces bases used by the Canadian Army are regiments of the Canadian Army. CFB Edmonton, Alberta, CFB Gagetown, New Brunswick, LFAATC Aldershot, Nova Scotia, CFB Kingston, Ontario, CFB Montreal, Quebec, CFB Petorawa, Ontario, LFCATC Meaford, Ontario, CFB Shiloh, Manitoba, CFB Suffield, Alberta, CFB Valcartier, Quebec, CFB Wainwright, Alberta, Royal Canadian Navy. Note: primary lodger units at Canadian Forces bases used by the Royal Canadian Navy are individual commissioned ships of the RCN. CFB Esquimalt, British Columbia, CFB Halifax, Nova Scotia, CFS St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, Royal Canadian Air Force. Note: primary lodger units at Canadian Forces bases used by the Royal Canadian Air Force are wings of the RCAF, CFB Bagotville, Quebec, CFB Borden, Ontario, CFB Comox, British Columbia, CFB Cold Lake, Alberta, CFB Gander, Newfoundland and Labrador, CFB Goose Bay, Newfoundland and Labrador, CFB Greenwood, Nova Scotia, CFB Kingston, Ontario, CFB Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, CFB North Bay, Ontario, CFB Trenton, Ontario, CFD Mountain View, Ontario, CFS Alert, Nunavut. CFB Winnipeg, Manitoba, 12-wing Shearwater, a unit of CFB Halifax. Home to 423 Helicopter Squadron. The RCAF supplies aircraft to Canadian Joint Operations Command, which frequently operate from a chain of forward operating locations at various civilian airfields across northern Canada, capable of supporting RCAF operations. CF-18 Hornets, CP-140 Auroras and various transport and search and rescue aircraft periodically deploy to these FOLs for short training exercises, Arctic sovereignty patrols, aid to the civil power, or search and rescue operations. All services, Department of National Defence Headquarters, Ottawa, Ontario, CFB Borden, Ontario, CFS Leitrim, Ontario, Connaught Range and Primary Training Centre, Ottawa, Ontario, CFNA Headquarters Whitehorse, Yukon, CFNA Headquarters Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, closed, defunct bases, CFB Calgary, Alberta, CFB Chilliwack, British Columbia, CFB Winnipeg, Manitoba, CFB Chatham, New Brunswick, CFB Moncton, New Brunswick, CFB Cornwallis, Nova Scotia, CFB Clinton, Ontario, CFB Centralia, Ontario, CFB Dance View, Ontario, CFB London, Ontario, CFB Picton, Ontario, CFB Rockcliffe, Ontario, CFB Uplands, Ontario, CFB Summerside, Prince Edward Island, CFB Shearwater, Nova Scotia, CFB Penhold, Alberta, CFB St. Hubert, Quebec, CFB Street Jean, Quebec, CFB Baden-Söllingen, Germany, CFB La, Germany, CFB Portage La Prairie, Manitoba, CFB Rivers, Manitoba, CFB Gimli, Manitoba, defunct stations, CFS Beaverlodge, Alberta, CFS Aldergrove, British Columbia, CFS Baldy Hughes, British Columbia, CFS Holberg, British Columbia, CFS Kamloops, British Columbia, CFS Ladner, British Columbia, CFS Masset, British Columbia, CFS Beausejour, Manitoba, CFS Churchill, Manitoba, CFS Flin Flon, Manitoba, CFS Gypsumville, Manitoba, CFS Coverdale, New Brunswick, CFS Rennes, New Brunswick, CFS St. Margaret's, New Brunswick, CFS Barrington, Nova Scotia, CFS Debert, Nova Scotia, CFS Mill Cove, Nova Scotia, CFS Newport Corner, Nova Scotia, CFS Shelburne, Nova Scotia, CFS Sydney, Nova Scotia, CFS Gander, Newfoundland, CFS Goose Bay, Labrador, CFS Frobisher Bay, Nunavut, CFS Armstrong, Ontario, CFS Carp, Ontario, CFS Cobourg, Ontario, CFS Falconbridge, Ontario, CFS Foymount, Ontario, CFS Gloucester, Ontario, CFS Inuvik, Northwest Territories, CFS Lowther, Ontario, CFS Moosonee, Ontario, CFS Raymore, Ontario, CFS Sioux Lookout, Ontario, CFS Chibougamau, Quebec, CFS Moisey, Quebec, CFS Mont-Épica, Quebec, CFS Lac Street Dennis, Quebec, CFS Senator, Quebec, RCAF Station Parent, Quebec, CFS Alsask, Saskatchewan, CFS Dana, Saskatchewan, CFS Yorkton, Saskatchewan, CFS Whitehorse, Yukon, CFS Bermuda, Bermuda. The Canadian forces were reduced during the 1990s from a high of 90,000 personnel in the late 1980s to the present force levels. Coinciding with personnel and equipment reductions was the politically controversial decision to close a number of bases and stations which were obsolete or created duplication. A small number of these closed facilities have actually continued operating as before. But, because of cost and administrative efficiency or, in the case of radio and radar facilities, automation they have been absorbed into other nearby bases and therefore do not qualify for separate designations. For example, the CF Leadership and Recruit School at Saint-Jean, Quebec, is now a lodger unit of CFB Montreal, and the former CFS Masset is a detachment of CFS Leitrim. Other facilities are now used as training grounds for reserve militia units. See also: List of Royal Canadian Air Force stations, List of Royal Canadian Navy stations, References.